The mind moved on. The body is still there. You processed it. You understood what happened, placed it in time, built a narrative around it. At some point, you even stopped actively thinking about it. Life moved on, and the situation that once occupied so much space became just another event along the timeline, passed, resolved, archived, and yet the specific tension in your neck that appears for no visible reason. The headache that comes back every time a certain kind of situation is in the air, even if only distantly. The tightness in your chest during a conversation that, objectively, contains nothing threatening. The fatigue that has no explanation in your tests, but is completely real. The stomach that reacts before any thought about the situation has even formed. The doctor said everything is fine. The mind agrees. The body is having a different conversation. Most people who experience this receive two explanations. The first is physical. Tests are expanded in search of an organic cause that often does not appear. The second is psychological. It's stress, which may technically be correct, but rarely explains the mechanism precisely enough to make any real difference. What is rarely explained is this: the body is not lying, it is not exaggerating, it is not producing symptoms without a cause. It is doing what it has always done, storing and processing experiences, only through a system completely different from the one the mind uses to remember. And it is this different system, older, more diffuse, harder to access through conscious awareness, that never received the message that it was over. Neuroscientist Larry Squire from the University of California, San Diego, spent decades mapping the different memory systems of the human brain. What his research established clearly is that memory is not a single system. It is a family of systems, each with its own neural structures, its own storage mechanisms, and its own ways of being accessed, or not accessed consciously. The system most people understand as memory, the ability to consciously remember events, facts, experiences, Squire called declarative or explicit memory. This system depends on the hippocampus. It produces memories that can be deliberately accessed, verbalized, and placed in time. That happened, I remember it, it was during that period of my life. But there is another system, which Squire called non-declarative or implicit memory, that operates in a completely different way. This system does not depend on the hippocampus. It does not produce memories that can be deliberately accessed or verbalized. It does not store events with time labels. It stores patterns. Motor patterns, emotional response patterns, patterns of visceral activation, the way the body learned to respond to certain types of situations, not as a narrative, but as an automatic response. And this system does not forget in the same way the declarative system forgets, because it does not store events to be accessed. It stores responses to be carried out. When the difficult situation was overcome by declarative memory, when the conscious narrative about it was archived, the non-declarative system may continue storing and executing the response that situation taught, not as a memory, as a pattern, as the posture the shoulder takes when a certain kind of conversation begins, as the rhythm of breathing that changes when an environment has certain contextual characteristics, as the abdominal contraction that appears before any thought about the situation has even formed. The mind moved on because the declarative system processed and archived it. The body is still there because the non-declarative system never received a different instruction. But there is an even more specific layer to this story, one that goes beyond the distinction between memory systems and reveals where, literally, these responses are stored in the body. Candace Pert was a researcher at the National Institutes of Health in the United States and spent decades investigating what she called the molecules of emotion. The starting point of her work was a discovery that seemed simple but profoundly changed how the relationship between emotion and the body came to be understood. Neuropeptides, the chemical messengers the nervous system uses to communicate emotional states, are not concentrated only in the brain. They and their receptors are distributed throughout the body, in the digestive system, in the immune system, in muscle tissue, in the glands, in the organs. What this means is that emotions are not simply brain events that the body registers as a consequence. They are events that occur simultaneously in the brain and the body, with a biochemical substrate present in both at the same time. Anxiety is not simply a mental state that produces secondary physical symptoms. It is a biochemical state that exists both in the neurons of the brain and in the tissues of the gut, the muscles of the diaphragm, the adrenal glands, and the blood vessels. What Pert drew attention to is that when the emotional state passes at the conscious level, when the mind moves on from an experience, the biochemistry associated with that experience does not necessarily dissolve at the same speed or with the same completeness in every tissue of the body. The digestive system can continue carrying patterns of activation from periods of high stress long after the mind has cognitively processed what happened. Specific muscle groups can maintain patterns of tension associated with old emotional states long after the original event has left conscious memory. The immune system can continue responding in ways associated with states of threat long after the objective threat has passed. The mind has moved on at the narrative and conscious level. The tissues continue carrying the biochemistry of what was experienced. Here, psychologist and philosopher Eugene Gendlin from the University of Chicago offers a concept that translates this biochemical reality into an experience anyone can immediately recognize. Gendlin described what he called the felt sense, not an emotion, not a thought, a preconceptual physical sensation, and something in the body that is clearly about a situation, clearly informative, clearly present, but that does not yet have words. Anyone who has ever stopped trying to find the right words to describe how they feel and had the experience that the words available simply do not capture what is present has experienced Gendlin's felt sense. It is the experience of there being something in the body that knows more than the mind can articulate. An emotional texture that exists before any concept about it. A physical presence of a state that the declarative system has not yet translated into language. The felt sense is relevant to what this video explores because, in many cases, it is the way the body communicates what it is still carrying from past experiences. The tension in the neck that has no identifiable medical cause but becomes more intense in certain types of relational contexts. And that, when you stop to observe it closely, has a specific quality that resembles the way the body felt during that period. The tightness in the stomach that appears before certain types of meetings, not because there is any objective reason for anxiety, but because the context contains sensory characteristics that the non-declarative system associated at some point with something that required vigilance. The fatigue that appears specifically during periods of stability, paradoxically when things are going well, as though the body, finally at peace, were presenting the bill for a period of mobilization that lasted too long. These are not symptoms without a cause. They are the felt sense of what has remained stored in the non-declarative system, trying to communicate something that is still being processed. If this describes something you have experienced, this specific mismatch between what the mind says is over and what the body is still carrying, this channel exists to put a name to exactly that. Subscribe so the next video is already waiting for you. But there is still a much more specific mechanism that explains why these somatic patterns do not simply persist, but can become literally frozen in the body's tissue in ways that resist conscious processing for years. A mechanism that a neurologist documented with precise clinical detail, and one that completely changes what the body hasn't forgotten actually means. Robert Scaer is a neurologist who spent decades working with patients who presented with persistent physical symptoms, chronic pain, unexplained fatigue, autonomic dysfunction, increased sensitivity to the environment, without clear organic causes being found. What he observed in these patients, and later developed into a theoretical framework based on clinical neurology, is that the nervous system has a specific response to experiences that exceed its processing capacity at the moment they occur. When an experience is too emotionally intense, or when it occurs in a context in which any kind of active response would be impossible or dangerous, the nervous system interrupts the response cycle before it is completed. And what remains when a response cycle is interrupted before completion, according to Scaer, are what he called trauma capsules. Not necessarily trauma in the dramatic clinical sense, but frozen physiological patterns, responses that were initiated, partially carried out, and then interrupted before reaching the completion that would allow the system to return to baseline. These frozen patterns become encapsulated in the autonomic nervous system and muscle tissue as configurations of activation that remain ready to be executed, waiting for an opportunity that often never arrives in a form similar enough for the system to recognize it as the same situation. But they wait, and while they wait, they consume resources. And sometimes, when a present context has characteristics sufficiently similar to the original context, even in ways that the conscious mind does not recognize as similar, the system recognizes the pattern and resumes where it left off, not as a memory, as somatic reactivation. What this produces is something many people describe with confusion and often with shame. A physical reaction that seems completely disproportionate to the stimulus in the present. The heart racing during a conversation that, objectively, contains nothing threatening, a sudden difficulty breathing in a social situation that appears, in every visible way, safe. Muscle tension that appears in certain environments before any thought about the environment has even formed. Mild nausea that precedes certain types of interaction without any detectable gastrointestinal cause. It is not exaggeration. It is not a lack of self-control. It is a response capsule being reactivated because the nervous system identified a contextual match that the conscious mind did not see. Neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp from Washington State University spent decades mapping the brain's primary emotional systems, calling them subcortical affective systems. What Panksepp documented is that these systems, seeking, rage, fear, lust, care, panic, grief, play, are fundamentally subcortical and pre-linguistic. They operate below the level of verbal consciousness, below the level at which the conscious narrative about past experiences exists. And panic, grief, the system of separation distress, loss, and threat to connection, is especially relevant to what we are exploring. Panksepp documented that when this system is activated intensely and repeatedly during critical periods of development, the activation patterns become deeply encoded in the subcortical system, not as memories that can be recalled, as states that can be reactivated. And when these subcortical states are reactivated, they produce all the somatic phenomena that originally accompanied them. The affective state arrives first, as it always does. The body responds to the state. And the state arrives not through a thought about the past, but directly as an immediate presence, because the system that generates it has no timestamp. This has an implication that is both unsettling and deeply relieving for those who live with persistent physical symptoms without a clear explanation. Unsettling because it means that the search for an organic cause for these symptoms may never find what it is looking for, not because there is no cause, but because the cause is not organic in the sense that medical tests measure. It is a somatic cause, stored in the operating pattern of the autonomic nervous system, in the configuration of muscular responses, in the biochemistry distributed throughout the body's tissues. And relieving because it means that these symptoms are not fabricated. They are not exaggeration. They are not the absence of a cause. They are the presence of a cause that simply is not where conventional instruments have been trained to look. Think about the most everyday examples of this pattern. The professional who developed chronic headaches during a period of high pressure at work, and who, long after that period has passed and the situation has improved, continues to experience the same headaches in the same types of situations. The explanation is not in the current work environment. It is in the pattern the nervous system learned during that period, and stored as an automatic response to the context, not as a memory of what happened, or the chronic jaw tension that persists long after a difficult relationship has ended, with no identifiable dental cause, but that noticeably loosens in the presence of certain people and intensifies around others, in ways the person only begins to notice after paying close enough attention. Or the digestive difficulty that consistently appears during periods of stability when nothing objectively stressful is happening, as though the gut, finally free from the pressure of responding to real threats, were processing the accumulated activation from earlier periods. In all of these cases, the body is not making things up. It is completing, processing what was left unfinished, in the only language the non-declarative system knows. Sensation, tension, a response pattern that the system still has on standby. There is a way to understand persistent physical symptoms without a clear organic cause that completely changes what is possible to do with them. They are not the body failing. They are the body communicating. The tension in the neck that has no identifiable physical cause is not a malfunction. It is the non-declarative system keeping a response configuration active that has not yet received the signal that it can be released. The fatigue that appears during peaceful periods is not exhaustion from the present. It is the deferred cost of a past that never had enough space to be fully processed. The stomach that reacts before the thought is formed is not malfunctioning. It is functioning exactly as it was designed to, responding to contextual signals that the subcortical system identified as relevant long before the conscious mind had any articulable information about the situation. Reconnecting with these signals, not to eliminate them immediately, but to receive them as what they are, is the first step toward allowing the nervous system to process them differently. Gendlin's practice of the felt sense is, at its core, a way of creating the conditions for that processing to occur. Instead of trying to cognitively explain why the body is reacting in a certain way, simply being present with the sensation that is there, with curiosity, without any urgency to resolve it, creates the kind of space that allows the non-declarative system to continue the process that has been waiting. Not all at once, not in a linear way, but in a way that the body recognizes as movement, rather than the freezing that occurs when the sensation is chronically ignored or suppressed. The body is not wrong for holding on to what it has held on to. It was doing what was possible with the resources available at each moment. Somatic storage is not failure. It is the way the system found to contain what could not yet be fully processed. The question is not how to force the body to forget what the mind has already forgotten. It is how to create the conditions for the processing that was interrupted, or that never had the space to happen, to finally find its way to completion. Larry Squire's research at the University of California, San Diego on memory systems established that human memory is not a single system, but a family of systems with distinct neural substrates. Declarative memory, dependent on the hippocampus, consciously accessible, and stored with temporal context, is the system that moves on when an experience has been cognitively processed. Non-declarative memory, which includes procedural memory, implicit emotional memory, and conditioning, operates independently of the hippocampus, does not require conscious awareness to be accessed, and stores response patterns that continue to be executed long after the corresponding declarative memory has been archived. Candice Pert's research at the National Institutes of Health on neuropeptides demonstrated that the biochemical messengers of emotions and their receptors are distributed throughout the body, not only in the brain. Emotions have a biochemical substrate present simultaneously in the central nervous system and in peripheral tissues of the body, which means that the storage of emotional states is not exclusively cerebral, and that the biochemistry associated with past experiences can persist in peripheral tissues long after the conscious narrative surrounding those experiences has been completed. The felt sense, a concept developed by Eugene Gendlin at the University of Chicago, describes a form of preconceptual bodily awareness, a physical sensation that carries information about a situation or state before any words about it are possible. It is the experience of the body knowing something that the mind still cannot articulate, and represents the way the non-declarative system communicates what it is storing to conscious awareness. The concept of trauma capsules, developed by neurologist Robert Scare from decades of clinical work, describes frozen physiological patterns, response cycles that were initiated and interrupted before their completion, that become encapsulated in the autonomic nervous system and muscle tissue as configurations of activation that resist conscious processing. When present contexts contain characteristics sufficiently similar to the original context, these configurations are reactivated not as memory, but as an immediate somatic response. Jaak Panksepp's research at Washington State University on subcortical affective systems documented that primary emotional systems operate below the level of verbal consciousness and have no timestamp. They do not store experiences as events situated in time, but as states that can be reactivated. When activated, these subcortical systems produce all the somatic phenomena that originally accompanied them, reaching conscious experience not as memory, but as immediate presence. If any part of this video describes something you recognized, that feeling that the body is still carrying something the mind has already considered finished, leave it in the comments. One word: what remained? Because recognizing that the body is not failing but processing in the only language the non-declarative system knows completely changes what is possible to do with what it is communicating. But there is an even more specific territory where this pending somatic processing becomes visible, or more precisely, visible in a very literal sense. Because when the mind finally has space, When external input stops, when the demands of the day cease, when the declarative system is no longer managing the stream of tasks and stimuli, the content that remained pending, both in the body and in the deeper layers of the nervous system, finds an opening. And the system uses that opening to do something it could not do while awake, not through thought, not through words, through images, through sequences that follow a logic that is not the logic of conscious narrative, through dreams that seem to deal with exactly what was being avoided, why the nervous system uses sleep to process what it could not process while awake, and why the content of dreams is rarely random. With a frequency that challenges coincidence, it is precisely what was waiting for space. The next video opens that door,